And welcome. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kitshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asot b'divrei Torah. And I'm going to head straight into the screen share. Okay, let's see what I can do here. All right. Give me 1 second there, and give me 1 second here. Okay, can you all see my screen, I'm assuming?
Yes.
Good, thank you. Only because it's been doing weird things today, clearly. Okay, and can you see my cursor? Can you see my cursor?
Yes.
Thank you. Yeah, I need you to let me know. So, just by way of introduction, so we are in Parshat Bo, and Parshat Bo is an extremely significant parsha. Chapter is in where it starts chapter 12, because in chapter 12, verse 2, we have the very first mitzvah, the very first commandment given to the Jewish people as a people. Yes, we do have a few commandments earlier on in the book of Genesis: be fruitful and multiply, the covenant that of the circumcision that Abraham is given. Basically, those are two that are there. But of course, the rest of the Torah, the next four books, have a tremendous number of mitzvot included. And sorry, I have, you know something? I have the wrong text here. Give me a moment and I will get the right text. Can you see that? Does it say Shmot? Did you see a new text, or you still have the old text?
Now it's the Shmot Yud
Excellent.
Bet.
Okay. It never used to do that, by the way. Zoom never used to do that. You used to have to stop the share and start a new one. Okay, great. So you see Shmot chapter 12, Parshat Bo. And the point I want to make here, by way of introduction, is there is a tremendous amount of detail that is poured into understanding these mitzvot. So with Rashi, it's still fairly brief, but when it comes to Torah Tamima, look at this. Okay, so there's stuff missing here that shouldn't be missing, but look at this, and we'll go to the next page. This is all Torah Tamima. All of this Torah Tamima. Tremendous amount. Look at all these quotations he has. This has to do with how you should cook the Pesach. These are laws concerning cooking the Pesach. And I think it's so important to understand that the reason for all that detail, it has to do with a practice of what does it mean to love the Lord your God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might. And to take that concept seriously and embody it into your life. And so that all this energy, all this thought that has gone into deconstructing these mitzvot is that exactly that exercise. Because essentially, and this is not supposed to sound trite, devoting your life to serving your Creator is understood as the purpose of life. That is really why we are created. And that of course, that gift encompasses so many other good qualities. But understanding the mitzvot in this very literal kind of way is exactly the embodiment of loving the Lord your God, because you care so much about doing God's will. And when you love a person, when you really love a person, making them happy, right? Doing things that will make them happy, one of which is when they ask you to do something, you do it as best you can. You try to understand exactly what it is that they want of you, and you do it as soon as possible. All those kinds of qualities. And so for a long time, I've realized that if we understood the relationship that the Torah tries to spell out for us with respect to God, is mirrored in the way we look at other people and the loves that we have in our own world on the horizontal plane. So, what's delightful here, though, is that Rashi gives us a taste of this kind of analysis of these mitzvot. So before we've had some, I think, pretty brilliant literary analysis of the text, but here we're going to go into it. It's going to feel a little different than the kind of analysis that we've had in the past. So here we are talking now in preparation for that last plague. There are mitzvot that the Jewish people are given. And this particular mitzvah has to do with the preparation of the Pesach offering. So, v'achlu et habasar balayla hazeh, and they should eat this meat, right, the meat of the Pesach, on this night. So, when you do it is an important issue, right? Not just doing it whenever you want, but allowing yourself to be instructed to eat it at a certain time. That is part of the gift. Okay, keep going just for the rest of the sentence. Sli esh, roasted on the fire, umatzot, and with wafers, right, matzahs, al merorim, on bitter herbs, yochluhu, they shall eat it. So you see this mitzvah notion that God is telling Moses, he's instructing Moses to tell the Israelites how they're to perform this particular act. So, et habasar, the flesh. V'lo gidim, not the sinews, v'atzamot, nor the bones. And this is interesting because this has other halachic implications too, that when we're talking about meat, we'll talk parts of the animal that are edible, because the sinews and the bones essentially are not edible per se. And when they are to consume the meat, they are doing that as an act of obedience to Hashem. So those details, this doesn't say, and not the sinews and not the bones. The text itself doesn't say that. But when it says, v'achlu et habasar, they're looking at that term, they shall eat the meat, and understanding that very, very particularly. And there's a reference here to the Mechilta. The Mechilta is a Tanaitic midrash on the book of Exodus. And it's a halachic midrash. It is in a way a precursor to the Talmud, to the process that winds up in the Talmud, and that's in Tractate Pesachim here. So this analysis is ultimately given in the Talmud, but in the Mechilta, which is extant, you can see a process of, it's called, as I said, a halachic midrash, because it goes after the laws, right, that are found here. There is no equivalent Mechilta for the book of Genesis. Are there midrashim? Indeed there are, and they are, again, involve literary analysis, but not in the terms so much of the laws and analyzing the laws. So, the reason why this has some implication is that because these particular parts of the animal are not considered the parts that you consume, that there may be some issues involving, for example, gelatin and things like that, and whether the laws of kashrut, which involve food that is consumable, right? In other words, for it to be called food, you have to be able to consume it. So there's this is ripe now for halachic discussion as to what the full implications are further on. And I don't know if Torah Tamima is going to go over that kind of mistake. See, this, he says, Be'eza basar amar Torah, right? What meat was the Torah talking about, right? And it goes on. So I'm not going to translate this right now. I don't want to take the time doing that, but I just want you to have a little bit of background here. Let's take a look a little further. So, al merorim, right? On bitter things. Kol esiv mar, any grass or any herb or any, I don't want to say necessarily vegetable, because esiv has more to do with herbs, right, and grasses. Any bitter herb, nikra maror, is referred to as maror. Vetzivam le'echol maror, and and now he's giving you, Rashi's providing a reason as to why we eat bitter herbs, which I suspect you all know already, right? And God commanded them to eat the maror, zecher le, and it's in remembrance of a verse. And the verse is, Vayimararu et chayehem. They embittered their lives. So look, being asked to be involved in construction and things like that, or doing field work, is not necessarily a bitter occupation. But the point is that the Egyptians went further than simply asking for their labor. They made it as tough as possible. There was a punitive element to it going on. Al tochlu mimenu, do not eat of it. Na. So na, we're going to have to translate, but it means basically raw. Uvashel mevushal bamayim, and boiled in water. Ki imtzli esh, but roasted, only roasted. Rosho al kra'av, its head, and its legs, together with its legs, al kirvo, and or it's probably kirbo, and on its innards, or together with its innards. So the entire animal, right? The entire animal is being roasted. Not necessarily eaten, but roasted. Okay, let's take a look at the Rashi. Okay, so there it is, na, do not eat it, na. So I looked up the word in Jastro, that's the J here on page 865a is where you find the entry. And na comes from a word meaning hurried. And so in this context, it means half done, cooked quickly, not fully cooked. It needs to be fully roasted. So this na means she'enoi salui kol sorko, as long as it's not fully roasted, not literally, it means as long as it's not roasted all its need, as much as it needs. Kor'o na, it is considered na. It's designated as na, bilashon Aravi, in Arabic. So this na here is an Arabic, borrowing from Arabic or an Arabic cognate. Although, again, na is not a common Hebrew usage for this. Uvashel mevushal, and boiled. So notice the doubling, vashel mevushal. So he says, kol ze ba'asara lo tuchelu. So he says, be careful. You don't want to understand this as meaning you should eat it boiled, right? It all comes under that category of how you don't eat it. Right? So you're not to eat it boiled. And again, this is a careful analysis. Bamayim, in water. Bamayim, there it is. So it says boiled in water. Wait a second. But you kind of boil things in other things. Like, how about fried? Would fried be okay? I mean, that's cooking something in a hot liquid, right? So, mi'nayin l'sha'ar mashkin. This is exactly what I'm talking about in terms of the analysis going on here and the deconstruction. How do we know that that law applies also to other liquids? Talmud lomar. For that reason, Scripture tells you, uvashel mevushal mikol makom. It means the reason for the doubling of the vashel mevushal is under any circumstances. So look at this desire to fully understand and so as to fully comply with the mitzvah. This whole notion of caring in this particular way, this is, I'm not going to say necessarily unique, but it is certainly a very, let's say, little understood quality from people who don't have this kind of background. They don't understand Judaism's attempt to love God with all your heart, with all your soul, and with all your might in a very serious kind of way. So, ki'im tzli esh, however it should be roasted. Now, he's going to tell you, lamala, above, right, just above this, gazar alav, the mitzvot aseh. God commanded this, as a positive commandment. He said, you should take this lamb and roast it. But look at this. It says, but only roasted. Why the repetition? Isn't it good enough that God told you to roast it? We've had these other clauses that have clarified the fact that it's not to be eaten except roasted. So why this repetition of this phrase, only roasted? So he says, V'chan hosif alav lo taseh, because in the previous section we were told positively to roast it. But here, it's under a negative commandment. In other words, you shouldn't eat it. Al tochlu mimenu. You shouldn't eat any part of it, ki im tzli eish, except roasted. So there's both a positive commandment and a negative commandment associated with making sure the only way in which you eat the Pesach is roasted. And of course, in a way, it's to emphasize, and I'm sure you can figure yourselves, that it's a way of saying this is really important, right? There's no wiggle room here. This is the way it has to be eaten. Rosho al krav. Now, this again requires some interpretation, right? Its head as well as its legs. Sol ehu. In other words, when you're in the process of roasting, it's not eating it, but when you roast it, kulo ke'echad, it needs to be in its entirety, all as one, literally. Im rosho, with its head, ve'im krav, and with its legs, ve'im kibor, and with its innards, right, uvnei me'av, and its entrails. So, I mean, the idea of putting the entrails or the innards into this roasting, in this roasting process sounds awful, okay, as to the effect it might have on the taste of the food, right, the taste of the meat that you actually eat. So the answer is noten letocho. He places, in other words, he says that this kirbo uvnei me'av, that its head and its innards and its entrails, he puts in it achar hadachatan, after they've been rinsed. So any offal that is attached to the innards there is rinsed off so that it's clean and doesn't give this awful taste, right? And of course it would be poisonous to eat this kind of stuff. It would be awful. So it's all cleansed. And if you've ever had kishka, right, which is the stuffed intestine, okay, it's amazingly delicious. But you have to rinse and clean the kishka, the skin of the kishka, very, very much. V'lashon al kra'av, meaning, and this expression of on its legs, literally is what it means. V'al kibor, and on its innards, kelashon, it doesn't mean literally on. It is like the expression in Exodus chapter 13, al tzivotam, meaning with their hosts. It means with. Kamo betzivotam, kamo chehen. In other words, when they come out, they're the hosts, the legions of Israel, just kamo chehen means just as they are. Afzeh kamo chehu, and in this case of the roast, of the lamb or the goat, just as it is. Kol basaro, I think it's mishelam, right? In other words, all the meat that it has. So let's go on a little bit more. Velo titur. So all these mitzvahs, right? All these commandments, these special ways in which this particular lamb is prepared, right? So it isn't just a feast. It is actually an offering. It's an offering. Velo titeru totiru mimenu ad boker. You should not leave any of it left over until morning. In other words, it was all going to have to be consumed. That is, the flesh, right, the basar that they're to eat, has to be eaten without any leftovers. Now, what's interesting is what we're going to have here is what I feel is an introduction of oral Torah into the Torah. Because having just said you shouldn't leave anything off, it goes right on to say, Vaha notar mimenu, and anything left over it. Wait a second, it just said you shouldn't. But here we're talking about leftover ad boker, that was left over until morning, ba'esh tisrofu. that you should burn in fire. In other words, the circumstance of having anything left over, ideally, you shouldn't have any meat left over, but circumstance, if meat is left over, this is how you deal with it. Oral Torah. Because, as I said, the subtext of the Oral Torah is circumstances alter cases. Law is affected by circumstance. And to keep the law is to take into account circumstances where it might involve, in a sense, breaking the law. But it has to be flexible in order to be practiced. Otherwise, it's only going to be practiced in principle and not in reality. And the fact is, of course, that understanding this is to understand that this analysis that we are going through in doing what we're doing is with the attempt to not make the law simply in principle, not simply idealistic, but literally to be able to live with it in our lives, in practice, with the circumstances, still knowing that you're devoting yourself to trying to perform divine will. And that's amazing, I think. And for that, I think the metaphor of taking the Torah from heaven down to earth, like that picture we have of Mount Sinai, is exactly what we're talking about. We are taking something that is in the heavens and could just be in principle and idealistic, and actually implementing it into the world. And I love, as you know, to give the example of theoretical mathematics and applied mathematics. That we live in a world that operates in this particular way. And I think let's just take a look. Yeah, let's do the Rashi on this. Vahanotar mimenu ad boker, and anything left over until morning. Ma Talmud lomar ad boker pam shniah. Why does it mention until morning a second time in this verse? Right? It mentions that phrase. It could have just said vahanotar mimenu, look here, ad boker, and then it says ad boker. But it could have said vahanotar mimenu ba'ish tisrafu, and that which is left over you should burn in the fire. But again, in meditating, in going over these words, I love the metaphor of if you ever were in love with someone and you got a letter from them, you'd read the letter once, you'd read the letter twice, you'd read the letter several times, trying to infer any messages that it might have for you. And again, us doing this, us saying the question, well, why does it mention ad boker twice? That's because we're obsessing on it. And that obsession, again, is an expression of love. So, Vanotami med ad boker. So why does it mention a second time? The 10 boker al boker. It's to give a morning over morning. Shehaboker mashma'o, that when it says haboker the first time, its implication is misha'at henetz hachama. If it just said morning, it would imply sunrise. Sunrise. Uva hakatov l'hakdim, okay, but the scripture is coming to tell you that it's earlier than that point, she'asur ba'achila me'alot hashachar, that in fact one is forbidden to eat any more of the Pesach offering from the moment that dawn breaks, right? The break of day, which, as you know, is before sunrise. It precedes sunrise by perhaps as much as an hour or so. I think it depends on your line of latitude. And that is, he's saying, that is the basic meaning of it. That it mentions that twice to make sure that it's not just sunrise, it means daybreak. Ve'od midrash acher, look at this, and they have a second interpretation of this. Lamad she'eino nisraf b'yom tov. It teaches you that even though the next day is a Yom Tov, right? It's Yom Tov, because the first day of Pesach, biblically, is a special day, right? A Yom Tov. It is not burnt, whatever is left over is not burnt on Yom Tov, on that day, ela mimocharat, but on the next day. In other words, the ad boker means it is in the morning of the day after the morning. V'kach tidrashenu, right? And this is the way you need to understand this. This is the way you actually parse it out. V'hanotar mimenu baboker rishon, and that which is left over of it on the first morning, ad boker sheni tamod v'tisrafenu. It needs to remain until the second morning, and then you can burn it. Wow. Huh. Right? I mean, talk about analysis and trying to mine meaning out of this because of this desire to, in fact, perform divine will. This is, to me, of course, this is beautiful. And this is some of the unique character of Judaism. Not to say that there aren't other religions that perhaps do this kind of stuff, but of course I'm not familiar with them, right? And I'm sure there are. Clearly, we know the Sharia in Islam. I'm trying to think of is it the Bukkaido in Japanese religion? I'm not sure. The Bushido, right, in there. So I'm going to stop the share here. And if any of you want to say anything or share anything, I'm happy to hear. Any comments, any reactions? Okay, you can hear my clock going off. I'm going to stop the share.